The first episode of this podcast on France and the European deterrent points to the repetition of the last 30 years of the French position on the European dimension of the national nuclear deterrent, as the interest of our partners seemed to drift away from it, and the message remained historical and quasi-institutional rather than linked to the consolidation of a logic of implementation. In this second episode, I would like to go into more detail on two key points in this debate. Firstly, the necessary link between strategic signaling and its operational extension, and secondly, the forms that a real and not just incantatory discussion between Europeans on deterrence could take in the future. In addition to its centrality, the French deterrent is based on the principle of strict sufficiency. This principle, that is, the limitation of nuclear resources to what is strictly necessary to inflict unacceptable damage in all circumstances, which is one of the pillars of the French approach, is consistent with a definition of vital interest that cannot be very broad. The format of the force de frappe has been reduced over time to ensure that it is permanent, strictly sufficient, and adapted to cover vital national interests. However, this is a dimensioning concept. In other words, today it determines the size of the deterrent force as precisely as possible. France's nuclear arsenal has been halved over the last 35 years. There are now fewer than 300 strategic nuclear warheads in the two components of the force de frappe. The Force Océanique Stratégique, comprising 4 ballistic missile submarines carrying the M51.2 and soon the M51.3 ballistic missile in 16 tubes per platform, each missile having a classified range of between 8,000 and 10,000 kilometers, and the Force Aérienne Stratégique, comprising 2 squadrons of 2-seat Rafale fighter jets equipped with the improved supersonic air-to-ground medium-range cruise missile, ASMPA, soon to be upgraded to improve its penetration capabilities, and each carrying an airborne nuclear warhead, TNA. This is before the entry into force and into service around 2035 of the hypersonic ASN-4G missile, for which the first studies were launched in the 90s to focus on very high velocity. Since the mid-1990s, the force de frappe has been based on 2 components, oceanic and airborne. The latest military programming laws reflect these, maintaining the tool in its current format for decades to come. For example, the deterrence missions of the 3rd generation nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, for which the program was launched in 2021, will ensure France's deterrence posture until the end of the 2018s. The national industry has been working to achieve this for the past 4 years. It is therefore important to bear in mind that French capabilities have not been developed and or produced for an American-style extended deterrent. Conversely, to assert today that what we can implement to satisfy a central deterrent will also be suitable for an ex nihilo extended deterrent in a virgin European framework would not be understood and would probably not be very credible. The European dimension of France's nuclear deterrent is too vague a formula to indicate the limits of the community of destiny that France shares with its European partners. Geographical limits, limits to the circle of its vital interests covered, limits to what can be promised when sovereign force is not shared in decision-making terms, as Emmanuel Macron reminded us in the days following his statement from Portugal. In other words, a honest premise that is as fair as it is generous should, to be truly meaningful, be complemented by operational reasoning. Nuclear deterrence is a defense function that is translated not only in political strategic terms, but also in rules of engagement for the use of force in a repertoire of cases. As it happens, such reasoning would quickly run out of steam given the state of our doctrine, our capabilities, and probably the social consensus on which the nation's life insurance policy is based. To date, brandishing the European dimension of France's deterrent has been hampered by the weakness of its operational component, which is the most decisive factor for our partners. And this is the main reason for the lack of real success of the presidential initiative announced in February 2020, which incidentally was not translated into a serious series of approaches to European capitals afterwards. At the extraordinary European Council held in Brussels on Thursday, 6 March 2025, several Eastern European countries welcomed the new French appeal. This was unprecedented. According to the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, whose country holds the rotating presidency of the EU at the moment, we need, I quote, to take a serious look at this proposal and, quote, any cautiously qualified the details count, he said, but France's willingness in this respect is very significant, end of quote. And for his part, Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda acknowledged that he had, I quote, high expectations because a nuclear umbrella would be a very serious deterrent against Russia, end of quote. While Latvian Prime Minister Evika Silina welcomed, I quote, an opportunity for discussion. But is it the operational aspect? That is the specific process that aims to transform the intention at strategic level into a succession of military actions conducted by forces to achieve operational objectives. That is at issue in the invitation that the French president is once again making today to open a discussion on the European deterrence. No, probably not. If by that we mean the implementation of an extended deterrent system. Whatever its success, the initiative will not lead to a move towards such an enlargement because it makes a much historical, political, budgetary, and no doubt social sense today as it did yesterday. And this is despite the exceptional historical situation that has prevailed in Europe since the chilling speech of US Vice President J.D. Vance at the 2025 Munich Security Conference. And I deliberately mentioned the social aspect of feasibility because if the extension of France's nuclear deterrent were to take shape in doctrinal, in capability, and in budgetary terms, it would probably require the nation's assent through approval by the parliament, or better still, through approval by the people in a referendum. That said, given the renewed danger of the European security environment, the states to which the French president is addressing his remarks can no longer be satisfied with a cosmetic dialogue. It would certainly not be pointless for willing European states to participate in French strategic air force exercises to strengthen a common strategic culture. But finally, everyone can easily document their intuition that the stakes are now more pressing for our neighbors and friends. In short, the way for European countries to come together around a French or a Franco-British nuclear deterrent is now narrower the more the initiative is analyzed in detail. However, the idea of a European deterrent is an old equation whose variables are not fixed in time, but are, on the contrary, highly dynamic because they are constantly being recomposed and adapted. Firstly, French and British nuclear forces are already supposed to play, I quote, a deterrent role of their own, contributing to the overall strengthening of the alliance's deterrence. And of course, this has been official since the declaration of NATO's Ottawa summit in June 1974. Then, even if the United States were to withdraw one day, the organization would not cease to exist as a nuclear alliance. And this was recently reiterated by Downing Street Deputy Spokesman Tom Wells. I quote, in terms of extended our nuclear deterrent or using it to protect other European nations, we are already doing that, he said. The UK is already committing its nuclear forces to NATO, helping to preserve Euro-Atlantic security. End of quote. And this reminder of the obvious sounds like a call for caution in the current context. A polite way of saying, be careful. A bilateral arrangement already exists. However, it's clear that to everyone that here the issues that need to be explored in greater depth to give them credibility are the ideas of contribution, the idea of global reinforcement, if only because they still ring too faintly in the ears of the European public. This is an issue that is partly related to what the jargon of deterrence calls nuclear signaling. Nuclear signaling is a central element of the deterrence function, which is itself a complex mix of defense functions, diplomatic and military practices, strategic reality, technological, industrial challenges, and the art of language and communication. Learning the language of deterrence involves mastering a concept that the Anglo-Saxons call nuclear signaling. In a famous 2002 text on the perception of signaling, the American academic Robert Jervis asserted that, I quote, signals are like a language in that their meanings are established by an agreement, implicit if not explicit. End of quote. In their strategic interactions, states use a vocabulary, launch actions, adopt behaviors in the form of signals, which are intended to be understood by both the sender and the receiver. Signaling can be defined as the signal and as the description that enables it to be identified in a common way. It's therefore any type of visible initiative resulting from a rational calculation designed to modify one or more strategic interactions between identified players. This was the case, for example, with the decision taken by the United States on 2 March 2022 to postpone the test of the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile so as not to risk fueling the Russian perception of the nuclear escalation of the conflict that was beginning in Ukraine. In part, President Macron's announcement of 28 February 2025 is a nuclear signaling. It still needs to be identified jointly by France, in other words, by all the French public, by the United Kingdom, which is also a nuclear power, by its European allies and partners, by its Russian adversary, and by its now problematic American ally in NATO. If we want the strategic interaction between France, its partners, and its adversaries not be durably modified by the French invitation, by the way it is received, and by the follow-up given to it, no political authority will be able to confine itself to a weak, to an ambiguous, or even a contradictory position. On the contrary, in this case, the strategic signal must be verbal, repeated, and capable of producing an echo so that it becomes a socio-psychological reality that transcends the competition of perceptions between the various targets to whom the message is addressed. Approximation in this area would be very damaging because truly useful nuclear signals are rare, and most signals sent out constitute noise, which does not require a common interpretation because it gets lost in the ambient cacophony. Secondly, deterrence does not just mean nuclear deterrence. The French president suggested, I quote, moving towards greater autonomy and deterrent capabilities, end of quote, without going into further detail. NATO's 2010 strategic concept itself stated that, I quote, deterrence is built around an appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional capabilities, end of quote. Then a discussion between partners must therefore consider the place of the nuclear component in a very specifically European overall system, also based on conventional capabilities. For a long time, the conventional part of deterrence was the poor relation of Western strategic thinking, overshadowed by the exceptional nature of nuclear weapons, the thermonuclear power level reached by the arsenals of the two great powers during the Cold War, and the scarcity of still elementary means of projection. However, it's likely that the main future challenges in terms of deterrence policy will not be solely nuclear. The variety of forms that strategic threats will take in the years and decades to come indicate that doctrinal thinking on deterrence must move towards a broadening of the range of deterrent means available. The US National Defense Strategy, published in 2022, for example, emphasized the notion of integrated deterrence, considering all domains: conventional, nuclear, cyber, space, information, as well as the entire spectrum of conflict from high-intensity warfare to the gray zone. It's not a question of rethinking the entire deterrent function of a defense tool, but of no longer limiting the debate and dialogue on deterrence to its nuclear component. This has long been the case in American doctrine, and as far as the French issue at stake here is concerned, our deterrent must consider the scenarios that the French deterrent doctrine needs to address so that the President of the Republic has all the options available to him in the face of the cases of strategic piracy that the Ukrainian precedent documents very much. In a doctrine entitled Supériorité opérationnelle 2030, which was unveiled in June 2020, General Thierry Burkhardt, then the Chief of Staff of the French Army, already warned that, I quote, the return of a major conflict is now a credible hypothesis. At a time when, he said, the cycle of conflict dominated by counterinsurgency is coming to an end of quote, which had mainly marked the 2000s and early 2010s with the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns. From now on, he said, the army expects new confrontation, symmetrical state against state, end of quote. And this analysis, vividly confirmed by the conflict in Ukraine, pointed the way to a useful renewal of France's deterrence doctrine by pointing out that well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened forces will always deter an insufficiently prepared adversary from attacking the country's security interests. The Chief of Defense Staff was already indicating a principle of discouraging opposing forces in the face of a display of determination. The concept of conventional deterrence does not traditionally correspond to France's means or to France's doctrine. But at the very least, it would be very useful to reaffirm that conventional forces support nuclear forces to prevent the rapid creation of a fait accompli, or to test the adversary's determination as soon as possible. This would be particularly useful thanks to conventional strike capabilities with increased power and penetration capacity. Moreover, at France's initiative, the ILSE, European Long-Range Strike Approach project involving Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and the United Kingdom, which was unveiled in July 2024, is typically part of such an approach and possibly of a future European architecture. In a context of increased duality of systems and technologies, the stakes for the discussion here are immediately different. They are more realistic and they are very promising, including in terms of deterrence. In my view, it would be good to consider that if nuclear deterrent forces are henceforth to be resolutely backed up by advanced conventional systems, it would be wise and it would be welcome to do away with the reluctance we have in our strategic thinking towards conventional deterrence. Finally, the same discussion should not overlook the articulation of future European offensive and defensive means of defense. In other words, going beyond the opposition between deterrence through the threat of retaliation and deterrence through the promise of denial will be very useful in clarifying their operational complementarity in terms of doctrine, in terms of use. As transatlantic communique now routinely states, missile defense can complement the role of nuclear weapons in deterrence without replacing it, and thereby maintaining a statu quo acceptable to all parties, let's say. According to the declaration of the last NATO summit in Washington in July 2024, NATO's deterrence and defense posture combines, I quote, nuclear, conventional, missile defense capabilities and in an appropriate manner, end of quote. And there are several variables in this equation, the details of which are beyond the scope of this podcast. But broadly speaking, it's Germany that is at the forefront of capability thinking on air and missile defense systems in Europe. The European Sky Shield Initiative, acronym ESSI, for example, was launched by Germany in August 2022 to facilitate the joint procurement by Europe of short, medium, and long-range ground air defense systems. 21 European countries are currently participating in the ESSI. As we know, the initiative was not enthusiastically received in Paris, which, like Roma, is not a member, not least for reasons of European industrial sovereignty. On the sidelines of the NATO summit in July 2024, Germany and the United States also agreed to deploy new American long-range conventional missiles at an American base in Germany in 2026, while Tomahawk cruise missiles and SM-6 ballistic missiles are being considered. Hypersonic missiles will be added at a later stage. Alongside the territorial and missile capabilities already deployed by several countries within the framework of NATO, the new American system to be deployed in Germany will effectively put an end to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, from which the United States withdrew in 2019. Since then, Berlin has been insisting that this agreement is a provisional measure pending effective European capabilities in this segment. In case the content debate can no longer do without an overall reflection on the following two changes to deterrence. First, the complementarity of offensive and defensive resources. Second, the role of conventional ballistic capabilities in achieving theater depth. The current French initiative must therefore also be seen in this context of capabilities, of budget, of industry, of strategy, and of doctrine. At the risk of being overtaken by the operational realities of the contemporary deterrence debate in advanced military economies. Ultimately, President Macron's new invitation to France's European partners is in line with a desire that has been expressed for a long time. The European dimension of France's nuclear deterrent has become stronger over time. It's already a reality within NATO, and the strategic environment is probably ripe for in-depth discussions with the countries that want them, of which there are now more. Opening such a discussion will be useful if it meets realistic objectives. To do this, it will have to combine a firm and constant strategic signal, a permanent operational concern, and consideration of the necessary industrial and budgetary extensions. Setting up thematic European working groups of civilian and government experts as soon as possible this year should be a prerequisite for mastering this complex process, which must not neglect a reflection on the conventional part of deterrence and on the complementarity between defensive and offensive deterrent systems.